You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. We're back talking football. Can't go wrong with that. It's football season. We are just under 2 weeks until Utah kicks off. So yesterday, Thursday, if you're listening to this on the day that I publish this, yesterday was 2 weeks out till Utah takes on Idaho. So looking forward to that. We're going to touch on a lot of different things as it relates to that. We're going to recap some of the top 25 stuff that came out earlier this week, so it's nothing too pressing there. But still recapping that as we move forward. We'll talk about the University of Utah suing a former football coach, and then we're going to do some fall camp takeaways, seeing that this is the last week officially of fall camp. We'll get into that, why that makes sense, but we're going to jump into that. So first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Utah fans, here's a little piece of local history. Canyon View Credit Union got its start on the University of Utah campus back in 1956. And nearly 70 years later, they're still committed to helping students succeed. That's why Canyon View CU awards $15,000 in scholarships every fall and spring specifically for the University of Utah students. Because college isn't just about earning a degree, it's about creating opportunities, chasing goals, and building a future. Supporting students has been part of the Canyon View CU's story since day one. Their roots run deep here, and they're proud to continue giving back to the campus community where it all started. To learn more about Canyon View Credit Union scholarship opportunities, visit canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. Nothing like botching a live read, but it happens. We move forward. Canyon View has been gracious to be able to sponsor our podcast, and they've honestly been great. And they really have been a part of the University of Utah campus forever. They changed their name several times a couple times, but now it's Canyon View Credit Union. So we're gonna jump into all this now. No more of that. We're gonna jump into football. Like I said, we're 2 weeks out, a little under 2 weeks out to football being played, which is the best news ever. I mean, if you count week 0, we're actually a week out. So it's close. We're looking forward to it. There's going to be a lot of fun had, a lot of chaos, I'm assuming, all the typical stuff. So let's jump into that first with a look at the top 25. That's just how this goes. It's that time of the year. Whoops, let's get the right graphics here. There we go. If you're watching on video, it's a little small there. I should have broken these up into 2, but here we are. Terrible quality from me. I apologize. We'll get this moving forward in a better system as the season develops. It's like it's my first show or something, I don't know what's going on here. Anyways, the AP poll drops on Monday. So it dropped on Monday. I released my preseason poll the day before so that you could see that. You can go view all of these on ksl.com, to kind of see where everything takes place. But the things of note here is that in the preseason top 25, the Big 12 has 4 teams. No real surprise for a lot of people that have been paying attention to this stuff over the offseason. Texas Tech comes in at number 1. They're actually, number 1 in the Big 12. They are number 12 in the AP top 25 as the leading team from the Big 12. Just shortly behind them is BYU, tied at 14th. They're tied with USC there. So a good spot for them, top 15 team. Obviously building off a lot of the success that they had last year. A lot of great pieces still on BYU's team, and I know Utah fans don't necessarily want to hear that, but still a solid team. There are questions like every team out there, but we'll see. I think, there's a lot of belief that what Kalani Sitake has done is going to hold over for this next year. So you get BYU there, really close, chasing Texas Tech. Depending on who you talk to, BYU may be the favorite from the conference. It depends on how it is. I think, if Brendan Sorsby were there, I wouldn't be surprised to see Texas Tech in a top 10 spot. So interesting situation there, but nothing too serious. And then you drop down a little bit further to Utah at 21, which I think is a very fair spot for Utah. I personally had them ranked 20th, so they're kind of in that mix there. This is a team that obviously has a ton of questions. And from the outsider's perspective, Utah lost a lot, right? Like you lose your 21-year head coach, you lose coaching personnel, you lose star players, John Henry Daylor, Smith Snowden, that kind of stuff. JJ Buchanan, these players that, not always were integral in Utah in terms of like being the most consistent, but at the same time, still quality players that left, right? And you then lose the offensive line, you lose all these pieces. And so it's real easy from an outsider's perspective to say, okay, Utah's got a huge rebuild ahead of them. Now, obviously, we try to give you a little bit more perspective on that and try to say, okay, yes, there is a rebuild here in terms of trying to make sure that there's consistency. There's a new head coach, but it's not quite as far off as we think. At least that's the belief, right? And I've hedged my bets a few times on this podcast too to kind of say, hey, it may not be perfect, but at the same time, I feel like we've done a good job of explaining Utah, right, and understanding where they're at. So the fact that they're here at 21, given Morgan Scalley being a brand new head coach, I think says a lot about Utah as a whole, right? You're obviously bringing back Devon Dampier. You're bringing back Wayshawn Parker. You've upgraded at the wide receiver positions. You've got a lot of these pieces there that can help you. It's just a question of can it all come together. And so I think, once you get past kind of the top 15 teams, a lot of those teams 16 through 25 are very much so, and even some of the receiving votes are teams where you're not fully sold on them, right? There's a belief that they can be good and solid and remain a top 25 team throughout the season, but there's enough questions there that, it's still a question of can they be there, right? Can they stay there? Do they have holding power? And I think that's where Utah is. I think that's absolutely fair. I think their schedule helps them this year, but there's definite situations here where Utah doesn't put it all together, and it's a tougher year for Morgan Scalley than is expected. I tend to believe more on the half glass full side of things where it's a little bit more positive outlook, not because, I follow Utah or anything. I just truly believe that they have the pieces there to be able to be more similar to last year than different. Obviously, those pieces have to come together. Lastly, from the Big 12, ranked is number 23, Houston. Now, Houston's one of those teams. I did include them in my top 25. So these are the exact 4 teams that I had included in my top 25 as well. Houston's one of those teams where I'm really iffy on. I think they benefited a lot from a weaker schedule last year. They have good pieces. They've been building. They bring in the number 1 QB recruit in the country last year. There's a lot of pieces there. The question is, can they do that this next year? And I think they're a trendy pick to kind of be in there. But at the same time, there's other programs outside of that you could replace them with. For example, the 3 teams that are receiving votes, Arizona and TCU specifically, I think could replace Houston there. And then Oklahoma State, that's a very trendy pick to try to get them, in that top of the conference tier, right? I think it's real easy to look at them and say, hey, everything's coming over from North Texas. It's a brand new situation. The resources at Oklahoma State are good enough to be able to compete. Can they do, somewhat similar to an Indiana where you can build and bring this roster together and kind of do that? With that said, Oklahoma State hasn't won a conference game in 2 years. So, there is a hurdle there. I think they're going to be better. I can't imagine a world where this Oklahoma State team is similar to last year or the last year before that. I think they will be better, but I don't know yet if they should be getting top 25 praise, right? They haven't done anything the last 2 years to even come close to that. And I don't know that the coaching staff or the player personnel that are coming in necessarily makes them enough to be in there. So, they're one of the lower receiving votes, which means probably 1 or 2 or 3, voters put them in. But I don't fault people for putting them either. Drew Mestamaker, by all accounts, seems like he could be a really solid player. Hasn't done it at the P4 level, and I hate that distinction that gets made. That was the distinction that happened with Devon Dampier last year as well, right? Like these distinctions act as if like quarterbacks just don't know how to play, right? With that said, there's some real stuff to that, but I don't know that this schedule necessarily is so difficult that, a jump up to the Power 4 in the Big 12 is going to be this massive increase for a quarterback. So, you hear that a lot from national media or local media or whomever you hear that from. Reality is he's still a player, right? And that's not to say that he's going to come out there and have the same success that he had at Tulane or North Texas, excuse me. But, it is what it is, right? And I think you always have to prove yourself at the next level. And I think that's where Drew Mestamaker has to be. And I think that's okay. I think this Oklahoma State team is going to be interesting. It would be a really fascinating situation if Oklahoma State goes in there and beats Texas Tech this year. I'm pretty sure those two teams play, if I'm not mistaken. It could be a really fascinating situation to shake up the Big 12. So, all in all, I think, the Big 12 is being respected as much as they can. I think that's a fair assessment of this conference. There's a huge middle ground there, right? You can argue that Utah could even be included in that, though I think many others, even the betting odds, include Utah more in the higher tier. But you could include Utah in that tier right there with those 5-6 teams where you have Utah, Houston, Arizona, TCU, Oklahoma State. You could maybe even throw Kansas State in there if you really wanted to, where, there's going to be a middle portion of that conference that is going to be competitive. We just don't know how it's all going to separate. So, that's going to be fascinating. With that said, the biggest challenge here for the Big 12 and the ACC specifically is this rankings list always continues to be dominant towards the Big 10 and the SEC. No surprise there, right? Like, these are the conferences that dominate the most, at least historically. They've won the bulk of the national championships in the last 2 decades. And so, outside of Clemson and, some other teams, there hasn't been a lot outside of the Big 10 and the SEC. And that continues to be the sustaining power. And so that's where a lot of that comes. Texas, Oklahoma, they obviously had some opportunities in the past, but they're now in the SEC. And so there's that kind of stuff. So, all in all, 17 teams from those two conferences were ranked in the power or in the top 25. 3 from the ACC, number 7 Miami, number 19 SMU, and then 24 Louisville, excuse me. Notre Dame obviously outside of that, though you can probably lump them in the power too, just simply based on their standings. So kind of the shakeup there. I know there's a love-hate relationship with the AP Top 25. As a voter, there's a love-hate relationship with it, right? My job is just simply to vote the best teams that I think right now. That is incredibly tough. There's nothing to go off of outside of what a team had last year, kind of how they've retooled. But me sitting here and saying Ohio State is the best team in the country right now is not really a fair assessment, right? And I understand that there's complaints and frustrations with that, and I get it, right? Because I share some of those complaints and frustrations. With that said, a team like Ohio State is the easy bet, right? They have had sustaining power. They're one of the best teams. They have the best resources out there, and they continue to fund at a high level. Those types of things aren't going to change. You have some of the top talent in the country. Those things aren't going to change. Yes, you can have a thing like Penn State last year where, I personally voted them as number 1 because of the all investment that they put into last season and the returning starters that they had and James Franklin being a really solid coach. Sometimes those things go kaboom, right? And so I think that's the frustrations that many people have with these preseason polls or polls in general throughout the season until a certain week. My best statement here is these are snapshots in time and they're just projections of what they are. And I understand these they base some evaluations on what it is. You go into that first, second, third game of the season, non-conference game, and you say, oh, well, they beat a top 25 team. Well, not technically, because there's no such thing as top 25 teams because we don't know how they play, right? I get that argument. So at the same time, you can be frustrated with it and you can just take it for what it is. It's a fun way to rank these teams. It's an interesting thing to be able to kind of categorize them and see where your team fits. At the very least, if you're a Utah fan, which I'm assuming you are given you're listening to this podcast, or even a BYU fan if you're listening to this podcast, you have a team that is being considered one of the best in the country. And that's the best thing that you can take. Whether they're 14, 21, 6, it doesn't really matter. It's all how it shapes up on the field. So, to me, like, I'm going to continue doing it. That's my job. I was asked to be a voter and I enjoy it because it actually gets me to watch a lot of games that maybe I wouldn't. I tend to watch a lot of college football regardless. But it's a fun opportunity to kind of evaluate these teams and see how they do. And no schedule is equal, right? Like, we get that. BYU and Utah both don't have to play Texas Tech this year. And so, those 3 teams kind of are in an interesting situation. BYU does have to play Notre Dame. So there is a little upgrade there, but maybe Notre Dame or BYU aren't good this year. We don't really know. The very least, we think this is how these teams are going to be at the beginning of the season. So I don't need to keep going there. You don't need to keep hearing me about the AP Top 25. I understand your frustrations if you're yelling at me right now saying the AP poll doesn't matter. I get it, right? All I am and all the other media members out there are just a bunch of voters who are trying to watch as many games and research as many things as we possibly can. It's imperfect. It's not a great science. Even computers make a mistake as well. I know there's people that say that, oh, the committee's better because they start ranking it later on in the season. Yet every single time that first ranking comes out from the selection committee, there's always complaints about how they're evaluated. Notre Dame was upset because they didn't make it last year. You've got all these teams. There's no perfect model, right? So just take it for what it is. It's a fun little snapshot. It's a good indicator of where people view you. The fact that you could get 63 voters together and your team is included in there just shows that there's at least some love for your team. Whether you're 1 or 25, there's at least some love for your team. So that's it for that. I'm not going to get too far more in the weeds there. Looking forward to the discussions there as the season goes on. Already there's a lot of vitriol for my ballot. I expect that. Look, I don't expect you to agree with every one of my picks, and there's sometimes where I look at my picks and I say, you know what, you really did kind of screw that one up. But that's the nature of it. You learn, you move, and you adapt. So that's how it's going to go. I'll try to explain any of my picks each week. I want to make sure that I'm transparent in what I do. It's not me just trying to throw that out in the dark, right? And hope you guys don't look at it. I want to be held accountable for those things. And I know there's many people out there that want to hold me accountable, aka my wife. So if you think you don't like my ballot, my wife probably doesn't like it more. So there's always that, right? Like, so you can be mad at me and my wife will probably agree with you. With that said, we're going to move on. We're going to talk to something that's a little bit different controversial. And that is, and I forgot my graphic to put up here. I'm really, really doing well. First show vibes. The University of Utah, it was reported yesterday from the Salt Lake Tribune that the University of Utah has sued former tight ends coach Freddie Whittingham. Now, they're suing him for what they're calling a breach of contract. He was set to be employed with Utah through the 2027 season. Now, you're hearing that, and maybe you have the same reaction that many people do out there. This is the nature of college football, college athletics. Why are we suing a coach, right? I think there's true validation there in terms of questioning that, right? But at the same time, I think there's also many people that can see the other side of it and saying, well, contracts should be honored. I'm not here to tell you which side of the aisle you're supposed to be on. My job is not to do that, right? My job is to present that information and showcase what it is. So Jason Pataki of the Salt Lake Tribune, unearthed those documents, found out about it, and reported on it. And obviously, that's the conversations that we have to go with as well. The facts here is that Freddie Whittingham was employed with the University of Utah. The expectation was that he was going to carry on through the life of his contract, like most coaches do, right? Every contract is there. There's some sort of negotiating and settlement, so to speak, that has to be done. The University of Utah is alleging that he did not settle any of that, didn't actually really give any notice, and was actively recruiting players to Michigan while still employed as a coach at the University of Utah. Now you can get into the semantics of that. Was he actually employed? Did they already know? Yada 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 yada. Right? It feels petty on one hand because it's like, look, how much are you really going to get out of Freddie Whittingham versus the 18 million that you're sending to Kyle Whittingham to go coach at Michigan? Like it feels like a different balance, right? But at the same time, there's many people out there that agree that like if there is a contract in place, you need to figure out a way to either get out of it in the right way or have the situation that you have where you're trying to make amends in what happens. So, at the end of the day, my guess is this gets settled outside of this. The discovery of this would be pretty fascinating to see kind of all the conversations that were had. I don't think either party wants any of that stuff to be out there and played out in front of the media. So my guess is there's some sort of off the books settlement type situation that takes place, right? But I think this goes more to that fractured relationship that has taken place with the University of Utah and the Whittingham family. You can agree or disagree that Kyle Whittingham was pushed out, that the heir apparent was there with Morgan Scalley. There's so much looking back, but I think, talking to Morgan Scalley, he wants to look forward. And so I think that's kind of the direction that most want to go. The problem is you do have situations like this where there is still kind of that look back, right? Where you're trying to recoup earnings, to kind of come after something because of recruiting. The recruiting element of this all is probably the most interesting to me. And look, let's not pretend that coaches aren't tampering or trying to get players to move over with them anytime, right? This is just college football, college athletics. This is what it is. So there's nothing earth-shattering about that, but the real fascinating part, and I don't think you're going to hear any of this, we can try to look it up, I guess, is that the conversations that were had of when Freddie officially, or maybe he didn't officially give his notice that he was going to Michigan, and the time that he was having conversations with players. Now, coaches are always going to have conversations with players, and so there's always going to be this middle ground that's a little murky. There's a lot more gray to this than there is black and white, and that's the tricky part. But I think as part of this becomes just another side note to kind of the chaos of the offseason, where Kyle Whittingham moves over to Michigan. He's going to go coach at a new place for the first time in over 20 years. And then all the fallout that comes from that. At the end of the day, if you follow your current head coach's advice, he's looking forward. He's had his time to explain all the situations that went on from his perspective. This is now an opportunity to focus on this team and move forward with that. He can't focus on Michigan. Now, the athletic administration, they can focus on that, but Morgan Scalley's personal belief is to focus in fully on this season. And I think that's probably the best direction to go. There's nothing you can do by, looking back, right? Nothing's going to change. He's in the position that he is, and it's a great position for Utah right now because, if Morgan Scalley is the guy that many think he can be, this is another great opportunity to have a solid Utah program for the next, whatever years. And so, regardless of this Freddie Whittingham suit, I don't think that changes anything inside of Utah athletics. I think it just goes to more of the infighting that was taking place, on the frustrations that were being had in terms of trying to negotiate Kyle's return / departure, whatever that may be. And now this just feels like another kind of side show to this. So don't read too much into it. I don't know that there's much there. It really is just kind of coming down into the nitty gritty of kind of the finality of that exit. If there's other discovery and it was found that he was actively recruiting players and somehow Utah sues Michigan or whatever, that is a bigger story in my opinion. But for the most part, this is a nothing burger. There's not really much there. Like I said, you may see this as a petty move. You may see this as a great move that Utah should be doing. Either side of that coin, I think you're probably in the same spot, right? Like it doesn't really matter to the whole totality of the thing, right? Kyle is no longer the head coach of Utah, and I think many people are okay with that because they wanted some fresh blood. Morgan is now the future of that, and we're going to see how that iteration of this Utah team goes. So that's where it's going to be. That's the focus, what it's going to be, and I'm really fascinated to see how this team moves forward. So with that said, let's transition to that team. This week, and this morning, I came back from our last live viewing of availability for media. We got a couple days this fall camp where we got about 20 or so minutes with being able to watch the team. And quite honestly, most of this was more position work. So there wasn't a lot of 11 on 11 type stuff or a lot of things where you're able to kind of get a huge breakdown. But at the same time, it helps in terms of seeing what's happening on the field, right? They're even just the position works. You get to see how guys are working, who is being given the reps, who are kind of standing out amongst those, and you kind of get a little snapshot of that. Now, all of the logistics of that we can't fully report, right? There are things that we can report, but we can't get into the nitty gritty of, okay, this guy was playing in this position, this guy was doing that. That's still, we've been precluded from saying that kind of information, but there's still context that we can provide as members of the media to this. And I think it helps a ton to be able to have this open access, right? Morgan understands that. And at the same time, Morgan also has to kind of invite as many people as he in to kind of get people to buy into this program. So this is advantageous to him, and it's advantageous to you as the fan because you get an opportunity to look into this more. I don't know if that changes as the years go on. I think this is Morgan's style, and as long as people aren't abusing that trust, I can see Morgan continually going with this. He's been very open in what he does. There's things that he's got to hold back, right? Like he can't tell us everything. And as a member of the media, obviously my job is to try to get some of that information out to be able to help you as a fan, but I'm not going to be able to get everything out there because Morgan has to hold things back. He's got to keep things close to the vest to be able to help his team, and I think there's a marriage there where you can give information, provide context to you as the fan who's asking these questions while still holding back to say, hey, some of this stuff you're not going to find out until game day. And I think Morgan, at least early, Morgan has done a good job of balancing that. Look, there's going to be a time, and it could be this season, where adversity strikes and things are frustrating and, fans are calling for Morgan's head because he doesn't know what he's doing and why did he call that play and all that kind of stuff. The real questions are going to come there where that adversity strikes. How does Morgan handle that? How does he adapt to that? And does he still remain and keep that open access and have that open air of conversations? That's going to be the real question for me. I genuinely believe that will still continue. I think he's trying to get as many people to understand the game as possible, right? The more you as a fan, the more we as media understand what he's trying to do on the field, the easier it becomes to understand what's going on the field, right? And I think that helps. Even today, Morgan just gave us a few snippets, just standing right next to us, kind of talking to us about things to kind of help us understand what they were going through. Where this team is at now is in their third week of fall camp, right? They've wrapped up all the fall camp portion of it. You can air quotation marks there if you're watching this on video or you're listening on podcast. That's what I'm trying to say. Those 3 weeks, essentially, they're the bulk of trying to understand position groups, trying to understand what needs to be done that way as you get into the game prep. Next week's essentially shifting into the full-time game prep, right? And then the next week after that is obviously the real game week, and you go into those modes. But you're starting to get Utah start to shift there. Today, they were already starting to shift into some Idaho work. And you may say, well, there's still position groups out there that haven't been figured out. Why are they focusing on Idaho right now? It's an FCS team. Why do they need to focus on that? No, FCS team or Arkansas, it doesn't really matter. And Morgan Scalley is trying to get his team ready. There's different looks that they're trying to get installed. They're trying to do different things to be able to be ready for that. And that's where it is. So for all intents and purposes, fall camp, as you know it, in terms of the installation of things and trying to work through stuff, is over. That's not to say that there's not still battles percolating or working on, or that there's not things that are going to keep developing over the season. They are. But it's now you're shifting into full season mode. And I think this is where it's going to be really fascinating, especially when we get to talk to the coaches next week for our last kind of conversation before fall camp before the full season begins, of seeing where they are now versus where they started in fall camp. And you still don't understand fully all that, right? Like I'm watching my 12-year-old son who's in football right now, and they scrimmage against themselves or they scrimmage against a team, and you feel confident about what you have because, look, our offense was able to move the ball against our defense, and our defense was able to stop our offense. So we feel really good about it. Well, guess what? Last Saturday, he had 3 different scrimmage games, and they got trounced because they weren't ready for the teams that they were playing. They felt good with the team that they had, and so they thought that they were going to be fairly solid. Little did they know they actually weren't. That could happen with this Utah team, right? You can feel very good about what you're seeing on the field because XYZ, but when you get out there on that field in real games, maybe you're not ready for those moments because you overcompensate something or you feel good about something, and so you kind of take things off. Like, that's where you have to find out with this team what's taking place, and you'll kind of get that. You won't know who you are until you get punched in the mouth. There's always that saying, right? And I think that's true for this Utah team. There's a lot of positivity around this Utah team and what they can be. At the same time, there's a lot of questions. And so I think, this is going to be really fascinating to see the progression of these players. We've heard a lot of great things, and I'm going to try to break down a lot of the position groups really quick. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of everything, right? Like, that becomes a real challenge. But I think we're going to get into a little bit of what this is. So let's jump into the position groups, and I'll try to give some other context as what we've seen or what we've heard or different things that way to kind of give you a quick look. So starting with the offensive line, which in my estimation is going to be the biggest question for this season. Trench play in general on the defensive side is going to be as well. But let's start with the offensive line. Earlier in the week, Morgan was kind of keeping the cards close to the vest, and he was saying that it hadn't necessarily come up with a starting 5. Now, do I fully believe that? No. I think he's just kind of saying, based on, some bumps and bruises that some of these players have had, they haven't fully settled in on the starting 5 in terms of being able to play together. So there has been some mixing and matching that may not be the exact same as when you get into the season. At the end of the day, regardless of what happens, Morgan and, Jordan Gross and Alex Gerke, all the people that are invested heavily into that offensive line, there's obviously others because it's the kind of the heartbeat of that offense. They're trying to find the 5 best players out there. And so to me, Zereoue Williams is a standout left tackle, right? Like, he's the guy that they feel very confident in. He's got the size. He's able to do what he needs to. To me, he's probably the most surefire bet on that line. There's other people there But I think, Zereoue is probably the locked-on favorite as left tackle. I would be very surprised if anything changes there. Nothing from what I've heard or seen indicates that there would be a change there, but, there's that. You also have Al Harrison, who's in the center spot. He's coming in there as the veteran player, has really cleaned up kind of some of the things that he needed to work on to be able to be in that spot. To me, he's kind of the odds-on favorite there. With that said, if things don't go right for him, Isaiah Kema, the transfer from Ohio State, is probably the guy that's going to fit in there. But I think Al has been more consistent in the fall, and I think you're going to see him there. So there's that. Now, the other three spots, there's a little bit of shifting. And some of that, there has been some injuries that have held players out. Morgan Scalley has talked about it. Some other coaches have talked about it. So there's been some mixing and matching. With that said, to me, your two other players that you probably want to put on the line in some form or fashion is Soloton Moiai and Keith Olson. Both of them have had pretty solid experience as depth players over the last few years, have proven that they can be guys. The Nebraska game, the bowl game, was pretty solid for these guys. They've proven it, right? It's getting that chemistry. Now, where did they fit? Where did they slide over? What did they do? That's the real question. Penciling this in coming into fall camp, Solotoa Moiai had as left guard, Keith Olson as right guard. Cedric Jefferson was initially tabbed as right tackle. I think there's probably a little bit more shifting there. And to me, this is my opinion. My opinion is that you put Kelvin Obot in that line based off of what I've seen, based off of what I've heard, based off of the physicality and the potential for him. There's a real belief that he could be kind of the Spencer Fano of that freshman season where, maybe he doesn't start the first few games, right? Maybe he does, but there's opportunities where as you're trying to get this starting unit together, there's an opportunity now to build and grow, assuming that Kelvin doesn't put, the team in harm's way, which I don't think he will. I think he's got the technique, especially as a left guard, let's say, where he can be really solid there. So I think there's going to be a way to try to fit him in, but at the same time, there's other players and how you fit them in. It all has to make sense. Ike Garcia, is also a guy that could very well play at right tackle. He's a guy that fits into that system a lot, and he's really made a ton of improvements to be able to be there. So, there's probably 5 to 7 players right there. Cedric Jefferson is in there as well. I think he's taken a little bit more of a step down, not because he's not talented per se. I think there's just others that have shined a little bit more, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's on the starting unit as well. So there's 5 to 8 players there where I think are pretty solid. You're just trying to find your best 5 and trying to figure out where they are. So the left tackle and center spots I think are pretty well locked up. It's trying to figure out what left guard is, right tackle. To me, you put Kelvin Obot at left guard. Then you have Keith Olson and Solotoa Moiai over there on the right side of the ball. To me, that's probably your best starting 5 just from the jump, especially knowing that you can get Kelvin Obot those early reps and kind of get him acclimated to it so that by next year, if any of these guys come back, which Zereoue can actually come back, some of these other guys can, you've already built kind of that consistency moving into next year. So, to me, that makes the most sense. But all in all, it sounds like there's a lot of good happening there. There's still some situational stuff that they need to clean up on. But for the most part, Morgan Scalley feels very confident about what he has there. So I think that's a positive thing for this team. Everything is moving well in that direction, and there's questions there. Just behind them, obviously, at quarterback, we know what the situation is. Devon Dampier, Bird Ficklin, Brandon Rose is your third-string guy. Devon has looked very clean in the times that we've been able to see it, especially today. He's got a great chemistry with his receivers. Now, look, every quarterback's not going to be perfect, but I think from him, you're seeing much more poise. You're seeing much more composure, much more fundamentally sound. And part of that is simply because he's healthy, right? Last year, he was compensating a lot for having 2 sports hernias, essentially by the time the Wyoming game hit. Having conversations with him on and off the record, there were very difficult situations going on late in the season where it was very painful for him to continue. And so he was compensating in a lot of respects to try to make sure that he could just be out there, quite honestly. And so, I think you're seeing from him a guy that is really developing and trying to hone in on what he can do best. Is he going to be a perfect quarterback? Is he going to take some monster jump forward? I don't know. I don't think so. I think there's going to be a different element to his game, especially as there's much more of a pass-heavy emphasis to this offense. But I think you're seeing a guy that is looking cleaner. Now, with that said, I can't wait till he throws his first pick and everybody says, great, Devon Dampier's still not the guy. Put in Bird Ficklin. Like, it's going to happen, right? People are going to be frustrated. He's going to throw it into a tight window, or it's going to be a bad ball, whatever it may be. And suddenly people are off the Devon Dampier, bandwagon, the train, whatever you want to call it. I get it. But I do think he has, at least from the limited reps that we've seen and the conversations that we've had, he is taking those next step forward. He has a quiet confidence about him that is just different, right? He knows more. He's got that chip on his shoulder from kind of being disrespected with his coaches leaving and not really getting the love from maybe the national media that he should, that, he can be one of the best QBs. He wants to be the best out there. And I think, you're going to see a much improved Devon Dampier. It obviously has to be seen. We obviously have to see if the offensive line can protect him and give him the time that he needs. But I think his skill set is best suited to when it's a fire drill, right? If that offensive line breaks down, he is well suited to be able to make plays. I've heard from several coaches where his best strengths are actually on the run, right? He's a great passer. There's some throws that he makes. You can see him on Instagram that the team posts or in different situations. He's great at being able to be on the run and then suddenly have a crossbody throw and hit his receiver. Like, he's capable of that. Now it's a question of, can he stay healthy? Can he do that on a consistent basis? So there's that. We'll see Bird Ficklin. You're going to see him in several different areas of this field. It'll be really fascinating there. Let's move over to running back. Wayshawn Parker's that guy. Excuse me. Wayshawn Parker is that guy. He has a different mindset to this season as well. He has that chip on his shoulder from last year where he missed out on the 1,000 yards, right? You can say everybody has a chip on your shoulder. It's the biggest cliche in college football. But I think there's some differences to some of these players, right? Wayshawn is approaching this where that really drives him crazy that he didn't get 1,000 yards. And it's, at the end of the day, it's just a little number, right? 19 yards away, you were essentially a 1,000-yard rusher. And I know that doesn't appease somebody, but at the same time, for him specifically, that has been a very big thing to kind of motivate him. He's not shy about his goals. He wants to obviously even step it up. To me, this running back group is loaded with him starting it, but at the same time, you've got Daniel Bray that has to factor into this. He's so speedy, so quick. He's able to do so many different things, whether it be as a pass catcher or as a running back, that just give Utah a different element that they don't have with Wayshawn. With that said, Wayshawn's still quick, right? He can do things. He's also going to be much more involved in the passing game, curious there. Beyond that, a name that we didn't really hear a ton about in spring, but we're hearing a ton more in fall, is Steve Chavez-Soto. I think, if anything, he's locked up the number 3 spot, maybe 2B, Daniel Bray being 2A, Steve Chavez-Soto being 2B. I think there's a good battle there, and I think you have a different style of player there, where as he's learning his techniques and getting more fundamentally sound, he's been much more involved in this offense, and you've seen it in practice. But beyond that, you also have 2 other players that are still working through things. You got LaMarcus Bell, a freshman coming in. The dude looks completely different from where he was at in spring. Not that he looked like a small individual, but coming in here into fall, like, he looks genuinely like a true running back at the D1 level, the true bell cow back where they can take the load, where they can be this physical specimen that just absolutely bruises, opposing defenses. There's still things that he's going to have to learn, right? As a freshman, there's technique, there's, pass blocking, catching. He didn't do a ton of catching at the high school level. And so there's going to be some elements to his game that he still has to improve. But there's been a huge jump up in production from him because he's been able to do that. And then Mariaki Halu, who moved over from the defensive side of the ball at the end of last year, he's really coming on strong, and you're starting to get a lot of people talking about him. He's going to be another solid asset for this team and being able to do really well. So I think the depth here at running back is pretty solid. A lot of versatility in what they're able to do and what they have, so that's going to be really solid. Tight end. This is a whole slew of players. You've got your Rhinos in Semi and Sione. You have Hunter Andrews, who's going to be kind of this everything player for Utah, that hybrid player that he's been. He can line up as a tight end and be a receiving tight end. He can line up in the backfield and take, the ball and run and do whatever he needs to that way. There's a lot that's going to be done with Hunter Andrews, and I'm really fascinated to see how they utilize him. In some of the drills they were running the other day, he was lined up as a running back, and we posted those videos, and you can go see those on my Twitter account or Instagram or TikTok, wherever I posted them. You can see him doing that. There's going to be a lot of room for him to develop Beyond that, you have those two rhinos, like I said, which are going to be more of the jumbo package type things. They can still be pass catchers. They can be kind of a fullback. They can be everything that Utah wants them to be. I personally want Semi Talonga to be a 300-yard receiver. That's not going to happen, but I think it'd be funny. I think it'd be great. I want to see him involved in the passing game because he can catch and he can do really well. And trying to bring him down, he's a force. So that's going to be interesting there with that. Beyond that, you have Noah Benny and Will Money, who I think, can be solid assets for this team in the tight end position. I don't know that they're going to be guys that you have to get the ball to, right? I don't think that they're going to demand that amount of attention yet. I think Will Money is getting to that point. We're starting to hear more about him and what he can do. And so I think there's still some variations with what this tight end room can be. And quite honestly, I don't know that we fully know that yet. I know that they're Kevin McGivern is very intrigued by what he has in that room. And going into spring camp, I would say that tight end wasn't going to be a priority or something that they focused on a ton. But by the end of spring and coming into fall, there's much more of an emphasis on being able to make the tight end a position group that can be focused on, right? Hunter Andrews obviously changes a lot of that. And so I think there's that. You also have the two rhinos that are going to change a lot of that. So, expect the unexpected. I'll say that, right? With the tight end group, because there's just so much there that can change. That is going to be interesting to how they do it. I don't think you're going to see a ton of 12 or 13 personnel, but I'm not saying you're not going to see that either. I think you're probably still going to get more 11 personnel, get one tight end out there and maybe have a jumbo set tight ends, something to that extent, maybe add more protection to that offensive line, as well as maybe providing some versatility in terms of the pass catching game. But for the most part, that's going to be a pretty fluid position group, in my opinion, outside of Hunter Andrews kind of being the star of that group. Then at wide receiver, I will say that there's so much depth there. And this is a stark contrast for last year or many other years where Utah probably had one guy, right? Like they had their X receiver. You might get two or three guys that can kind of factor into that, but they've never had the depth that they've had now. With that said, I always add this caveat to this is it has to show up, right? It's great to have guys. I mean, you come into last season, there was so much talk about who Tobias Merriweather could be. The size, the intangibles, everything that way was like, okay, great. Utah finally has this guy that can go get 50-50 balls. He's got these intangibles that make him kind of the dude to be a wide receiver one, and it just didn't live up to those expectations. With that said, Utah brought in guys that have been much more proven and have had connections, been able to separate and do what they need to. And so I think there's going to be growth opportunities there. With that said, Braden Pagan is the guy. Everything that we've seen, everything that we've heard, he is the guy that has the best connection with Devon Dampier. You can see it. They're always together. If you see them on the Instagram videos or TikTok videos, they are doing everything together. And there's a deep connection there. And Braden Pagan has done a ton of work to be able to continually improve his game from already a really solid season at Utah State last year. So to me, he's wide receiver one. He's your X guy. He's the guy that you can go jump ball, go deep, do whatever you need to with him. Coming into the year, I thought Kyrie Scholes was going to be there. And we haven't quite heard his name there because I think there's other guys that have stepped up and kind of jumped above him. But the fact that he's a guy that is kind of being overlooked in a lot of this is a good thing for Utah because he did have a lot of production at San Jose State. With that said, you've got Larry Simmons, who has come on strong at the end of last season and is really kind of continually developing as a player this year. Today, I can't fully take into account what today was because right now Utah's in more of like what's considered thud work. There's not true pursuit to players on the offensive side of the ball or anything that way. They'll coalesce around a player or something, but there's not wrapping up. There's no tackling. There's none of that stuff. And so you're kind of at 75% speed, if not a little less on these things. But he and Devon Dampier connected on a really great play today in some of their situational work. Devon hit him in stride down the sideline, and it was just a beautiful play that these two connected on. And I think you're going to see a lot of that with Larry developing and growing. So to me, he kind of becomes one of those other receivers that is going to factor into this a lot. And the third name that I would say is actually going to be Ricky Johnson, a name that you didn't really hear a ton about coming into spring and maybe not even into fall, comes in from Mississippi State. And so many people are gushing about him. He has done so well in fall camp that I think he's kind of earned that third spot. So the three top receivers there being Braden Pagan, Larry Simmons, and Ricky Johnson, those three are probably in the mix for your top three. Beyond that, you do have Kyrie Scholes, and I think you're going to be able to see him in there. You've got Creed Whittemore. You've got Nate Johnson. If you saw an Instagram video yesterday, I believe, Nate Johnson had a one-handed catch. I mean, there's the fact that you can get him in there is pretty solid, and he actually looks much more like a wide receiver. You're seeing him develop. You have Dadrian Zipperer, who I'm trying to remember which coach said it. His biggest thing is just staying healthy. If he can stay healthy, he's going to be fine, and they feel like they have a great asset in him. They feel really good about. So at the very least, you have 6-ish or more wide receivers that they feel very confident in. There's not going to be enough room for all of these guys to eat the way that they want to. The difference here, though, is if you can ride a hot hand or you can get a guy that kind of pops off on one game, all the better. Because if Braden Pagan's not able to get the ball because they're bracketing him or double teaming him or whatever you want to call it, maybe somebody else can eat, right? You got Larry Simmons, you got Ricky Johnson, you got Creed Whittemore, you've got Nate Johnson, you've got Kyrie Scholes. You've got a lot of guys that can kind of be factored into that. They can utilize and move forward with. So really solid opportunity for this Utah team to be able to advance with this. There's a lot of talk about this being one of the best units that Utah's had, and I truly believe it. To that point, I didn't even mention Tobias in there. The fact that he's kind of being thrown in there, I know he's made improvements as well. I really want to see if he can kind of take a step forward, and if he can, all the better, because now you've added even more depth to that room. So wanted to kind of give that side note. But like I said, if you can get all these things to come together, a really solid opportunity for this Utah team on the offensive side of the ball, and really fascinated to see how that goes. All right, let's jump over to the defensive side. Sorry, I'm going through this all pretty quick. I want to just make sure that we're hitting all these things, and we're going to kind of get into more stuff as we go into next week, and then we'll obviously get into game week in a little over 10 days or so, maybe even less than that, and we'll break down Idaho. But this side of the ball is really fascinating to me because there's a lot of how I want to put it is I don't know that there is. I don't even want to call it a star player. I think there's many players that can be stars. And I don't know that we fully know it yet. And I'll explain that as I go through this, right? What I'm saying here is there's a lot of proven guys who have done a lot of good things for this defense already. There's a lot of guys that have a lot of potential who we, think that can do really well. I don't know that there's one name here where you can point to and say, yep, that's the guy, right? Whereas in years past, there's sometimes that guy. With that said, I think this defense can be really solid. And if you believe Morgan Scalley, you believe Sharif Shah, who Sharif is very hard on his position groups, he still speaks glowingly of this in terms of the talent there. The secondary is arguably the best unit on this defense. And last year, they already had one of the best pass defenses in the country, especially in the Big 12. If they can maintain that, if not even get better, all the better for this team, right? They feel like they have a lot of physicality there on the outside in the secondary, in the safety room. There's depth. They feel like they've got what they need to. Once again, all that stuff has to show up. All of these things have to show up, and that's the biggest thing with this team. Utah they have a high ceiling, but at the same time, their floor is much lower than maybe you would expect just because there are these questions. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, they can be 10-2. Well, yeah, they can. They can as very well as be 5-7. Now, I don't really think that based off of this schedule, barring Utah having just a run of bad luck, this team really just kind of falling apart. I don't believe that that's how this team is made up, but it can happen. I'm just saying that the floor and ceiling disparity is much larger than it was last year just because of so many unknowns. With that said, I do believe in this defense, and I think they've cleaned up a lot of what were some of the problems last year and actually improved in some areas as well. Secondary being one of those where you have a lot of physicality, guys that are going to go toe-to-toe with any of these wide receivers and try to mix it up. If anything, sometimes there's too much physicality and you have to kind of dial it back. I'm really fascinated to see how they use these guys. Do they dial up more corner blitzes, guys that can get in there and just absolutely disrupt that backfield? Are they going to just use them as lockdown guys? Scooby Davis is a guy that's obviously had a lot of success and been a guy that people know and trust, and he's been really solid for Utah. But on the other side of the ball, you've got Elijah Reed, who's really kind of stepped up that level and has been the guy that they feel confident about, next to James Chenault, who also is a guy that is going to be factored into there. So there's going to be this rotation of guys that they feel comfortable with in the corners spot. Those will also be pretty interchangeable, Elijah Reed talked about that in Tuesday's media availability, where he talked about guys being able to shift out from corner to nickel to safety pretty regularly and fluidly, that it makes this group very versatile, right? Maybe you can change different looks in what you do and try to distract or not distract, confuse the quarterback as you try to simulate different things or different looks that allow you to do it. Say Elijah Reed lines up as a corner, and maybe it shifts into something different, right? There can be a lot of things to be able to make this look different. So secondary is probably the biggest strength there. Looking at safety, I forgot to add them in here. Jackson Benny and Rabbit Evans are likely your two starters there, but you also have Nate Ritchie, Nate Tillman, Manny Fuller, guys that can kind of add that depth there that are going to be factored into there. You also have Rock Caldwell, who's going to be a nickel, but Jackson Benny can fit into that nickel. You can have other guys fit into there that I think you're going to be pretty versatile in what they do. Like I said, you're going to disguise a lot of what you do there just simply because of what Utah wants to do. And the versatility that you have is going to make that work. So really fascinated to see how this all comes together on that front, but they feel very confident in their depth there and what they're able to do. Let's go jump up to the front. Let's talk about the big guys. Let's start with defensive tackles there. This is a group where I think Utah has improved. And I say I think because we don't know yet. There's guys that have a ton of potential there and guys that have gotten some good reps last year and have seemingly taken the next step forward. This group up front, their biggest focus is going to be tackling and gap assignments. Last year was not great, especially late in the season with gap assignments and being able to be pushed off your block or just really just being, the integrity of being in your position and doing what you need to, that has to remain. And there's been a big emphasis and focus on that. Every single practice, Morgan Scalley says they focus on this stuff. So I think that's getting drilled in their head a ton in terms of what they need to do. The question is just who's going to be the guys that do it. We think that the focus there is probably going to be Pupu Sepulona, Carson Kafusi, and Jai Moy. Those three are probably the leaders of that group in terms of the rotation. And then you kind of have that next set of Lucas Amsula, who, a really solid player, comes from Wyoming, really adds to that piece. So you've got four players, in my estimation, that are really going to kind of be the focus of that group, that can kind of rotate, be fresh. It sounds like Utah wants to be pretty fresh there, that they're not necessarily going to try to stay with just two guys consistently. Obviously, if they have the hot hand and they can do it, all the more power to you and you run with that. But I think they feel confident and versatile in what they do there. I think, Carson Kafusi, he's been a little banged up, and so that's kind of limited him a little bit. But his size, his physicality, the traits there, he's a great person to be able to be in that defensive tackle room. And if he can kind of be there for this Utah team, he's kind of the odds-on favorite there. But you do have Pupu Sepulona and Jai Moy, who are just great assets to this defensive tackle room. They take on blocks well. Jai Moy in warm-ups the other day in position works, I mean, he's taken on two guys, I don't want to say easy, right? Like, these guys are big humans, and when you come at real speed, it becomes different. But he handles that very well. He's quick. He's shifty. He's got great, feet and what he's able to do. Being able to be sound in your assignments, that's going to be the key here, especially for somebody like that who can be shifty and move around and have that lateral movement. That's where this defensive tackle room is going to really thrive. And on the outside, it's another rotation there where I'm really fascinated to see how this all comes together, because there's so much talent there on the defensive ends where, there's versatility too. They're all different types of players. There's some that look more like your prototypical edge, where you have others that are a little bit smaller, but at the same time have different skill sets, and maybe they're quicker and have quicker bursts or whatever that may be. There's a lot of different mixing and matching that you can do. And by all accounts, most of this has gone really well for this group. Lance Holtzclaw, I wrote a story about him today and kind of the direction that he's been moving forward in. You can go read that on KSL.com and see about his leadership role and what he's done. To me, he's kind of the odds-on favorite to just be a starter. I think of the four that I'm going to talk about, he's the guy that you probably pencil in as kind of the guy. That's not to say that he's going to be the star of the defense there, but I think that he's the odds-on favorite to be just kind of the anchor that helps this team. I think he's got a lot of potential. He's shown a lot. His leadership characteristics have really shown up this year to be able to help this team. He pushes people. He's not afraid to confront people in obviously a positive way, but ways to be able to help them grow. I think this is his spot to lose, so to speak. But I think there's going to be a lot of rotating and a lot of movement there that I don't think, I mean, obviously if he's doing well, you're not going to take him off the field, but I think they feel confident in what they have behind him, that it's not a huge drop off when you need to take Lance off the field. With that said, the other three guys, Cash Dillon's a guy that, we're waiting to see it develop, right? There's a lot of belief in the potential of what he can be, and I don't know that we've fully seen his potential yet and what he's able to do. That to me is going to be the biggest question, because you've got two other guys that are hungry and ready to go and are ready to just absolutely feast on that line in Ethan Day and Paul Fitzgerald. Paul Fitzgerald was injured all of last year and has really come on strong this last little part of camp. There's been a lot of talk about his ability to be able to move forward and kind of take those reps. I wouldn't at all be surprised to see him in a starting role this year, just based on kind of the progress that he's made. But Ethan Day is also having a really solid year. He's put on great size. He's lean. He's physical. He looks like your prototypical edge, a guy that can get in off the edge and just absolutely wreak havoc on opposing offenses. I'm really fascinated to see. He just, like, he's the happiest guy out there, but at the same time, he goes out there with reckless abandon, right? Like, he wants to kill you. And then smile above you because he just did his job, right? Like, he's a guy that I'm really fascinated to see develop here, because what we've seen in camp is pretty great to see. So I think there's going to be, at least 4 players that are going to round that position group out. They have some depth there. Like last year, we didn't know that John Henry Daly was going to emerge the way that he did. Are one of these players going to do that? Maybe. I don't know that there's going to be maybe that kind of glow up. Utah hopes so, that they have somebody that can be the sack machine like John Henry Daly was. But I think as a totality, in the terms of these 4 guys, there's a lot of versatility in options that you're able to do for this team. So I think that's going to be a pretty solid opportunity for what Utah does. So let's round this out now with the linebacker, which to me, I have the most questions for. And when I say most questions, it's not that I think this position group is going to be bad. I think there's just a little more inexperience there in terms of the total experience there and the depth of what Utah's going to want. Everything around that linebacker group, I think, is going to be pretty solid. They have at least the potential and the depth pieces to kind of mix and match and do what they need to. Whereas at linebacker, I don't know that yet. Now, with that said, there is a proven commodity in Jonathan Hall. And for those that, are already going to be upset that I'm mentioning Jonathan Hall because he had some struggles last year, one, not all of those were on him. And yes, there were things that were on him. There's, as a linebacker, it's all about angles and it's all about being, assignment sound as well. But when you have a defensive line that's not doing their job, it makes it much more of a challenge for the linebacker to do theirs, right? He talked about that to us as media, saying it's so much easier this year to be able to have that where he doesn't have to, it's like you don't have to think as much. You can just be more instinctual. You need your linebackers to be instinctual. And when you have to think and make sure you're ready and you're not biting on the wrong thing, it makes it much easier if he can do that. And that's where Jonathan Hall needs to take that next step this year. If so, he's going to be a very solid asset for this Utah team. He's got experience. He can do what he needs to. This is still a newish position for him. He's only been in it for the last 2-ish years. And so there's still some things that he's learning. But I think if he can make those next steps, Utah's in a fine spot with him there. And I think there's consistency there. I think it's more just we want to see it, right? I'm curious to see how he interacts with that defensive line in front of him in terms of what he's able to do. And do we get to see a much improved Jonathan Hall because of the improvement up front? Or is it more of the same thing as we saw last year where, the grades can be good at times and then they can be bad at times because of what's happening. So really fascinated for his year. And then next to him is Trey Reynolds. Trey Reynolds is a guy that has moments where he just absolutely pops off in the times that he's gotten it. He's a guy that has really kind of developed and grown, but he just hasn't had a ton of playing experience in terms of like starting units. He has started at times. So I don't want to say that he hasn't, but I think it's more just the totality of that, of working together and that chemistry and communication. At linebacker, probably more than most positions on that defense, they all have to communicate on the defense, but these guys have to be in sync and understand what they need to. And as of right now, it sounds like they've been in a pretty good sync. Like they've done really well. and they've worked well together. It's just learning the experience, right? It's the trying to figure out if Devin Lloyd is Devin Lloyd, right? I'm not saying that Trey Reynolds is Devin Lloyd or that Jonathan Hall is Devin Lloyd. They're totally different players, but you get the point that I'm trying to say is when Devin Lloyd came in, there was questions, can he be the guy? And then he turned into this NFL, caliber player. We have to see it to believe it. And I think that's where we're at with both of these guys. We have to see it to believe it. Because behind them, you got Cyrus Polu, who's much more of a versatile linebacker who can do so much more. He's rangy, he's physical, he can mix it up with a lot of different things. He's a guy that's going to factor into that as well, and I think he's had a very solid camp. So, I think you've got standout 3 players that can do really well. The question beyond that is who fills in for these guys. There's other guys there that can be kind of factored in, but we really haven't heard a lot about the depth at linebacker. And so to me, this position group, if there is a weak link, and I don't even want to say that because I don't think it's a weak link, but I would say the one that has the most questions, it's probably this linebacker group, and it's more based off of that depth. And so if we can see the depth and we can see the ability of what they're able to do, I think that's going to be a good thing. If you can have, assuming the defensive line does their job and the secondary does its job, like we assume that they're going to do, if this linebacker unit comes out and let's say against Arkansas stands out really well and they look like one of the stars of the defense, I think this defense is going to be fine this year. I think if that communication can work, if they can do what they need to, there's not really any reason to worry. So that's my breakdown, the takeaways. There's positive vibes all around. They understand that they're not there yet. Morgan Scalley's talked about that there needs to be a better consistency in the red zone. That obviously is going to come, and the consistency of being able to work together, that becomes a difficult challenge there. Really curious to see the red zone packages that they utilize there. Is that going to be the fatal flaw of this offense? I don't know. Can they move the ball until they get to the red zone? We've seen that before for Utah offense. If they can't get that cleaned up, that's the worry there. But I think by and large, there's a lot of positive vibes around this Utah team and what they're able to do. But like I said at the very beginning of this, you don't know what you have until you get smacked in the mouth. And I don't know that you're going to fully learn anything there about that against Idaho. You're going to learn stuff, right? The first punt that Utah has to take against Idaho, you're going to see a bunch of people upset about that, especially if it didn't look good because Utah goes 3 and out or there's a pick or there's something crazy out there, right? There's going to be adversity. But at the same time, I think this team feels good about what they have, the pieces that are there, the depth that they have, and the opportunities at hand. So really curious what's going to happen. Next week, we're going to start jumping into that a little bit more, break down what these coaches said and kind of understand what's happening that way. And then we transition into game week and we go, week by week. So really looking forward to that. Go check out our content. You can follow me obviously on Twitter and Instagram, TikTok. You can read my stuff at KSL Sports. Also, go read my colleague, Steve Bartles. We are together, working together. I know that sounds odd, but years past, we weren't working together because of the way that our company structured things. We are now together, so go read his stuff as well. He does a phenomenal job. He does a lot of daily podcasts where he's interviewed a lot of great people. He provides great insight. I want you to go read and listen to his stuff as well because we're going to try to tag team every element of this team. So with that said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Go check out some great high school football games. There's some fun football in this state. Get us ready to go for football in a couple weeks, and then we're going to get into this season. So looking forward to this. Hope you guys all have a great day, and we will chat with you later.